Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Lamed Zayin. It's the daf for Shabbat. I want to remind everyone that on Sunday this week starts the three-part series of Rabbanit Sarna. So if you're not yet registered, please register. The course is free of charge, and it's a continuation of all the background information. It's helpful to understanding how to tackle Gemara on your own, how to understand Gemara. It's not exactly a skills course that we're going to have later on in the year, but it is a bit the background and how the logic of the Gemara works. So now we're going to start our daf. The Gemara starts off, we were discussing this debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about whether when I acquire the proceeds of an item, do I also have rights to the body, the actual item itself, meaning can I sell it, right? And what are the ramifications? So we now see that tannaitic means it's a machloket tannaim. This debate that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish were Amoraim were having was actually an earlier tannaitic debate. We're going to learn between Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Ditanya, as it says in a braitot, if you promised your property to someone and then after that you wanted to go to someone else, meaning when they die, it will go to the other person. What that really means, as we discussed, is that you're really giving the person the proceeds of that land, but the actual land itself is going to the next person. And to whoever's going to finally inherit, they're the ones who really own or will own the goof, the actual item itself, the land, it's the principle. The yarad rishon umachar va'achal. Now, if the first person sold it and then achal, then consumed all the proceeds from the sale, and there's nothing left to pass to the second person, hashini motzim yada lekuchot. The second person can demand it back from the people who purchased it. Divrei Rebbi. This seems to match the opinion, or it does match the opinion, that kinyan braitot is not kinyan aguf, and therefore the sale wasn't a valid sale because it wasn't even the possession of that person to have been able to sell it. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, "Ein l'sheni ela ma sheshiyah rishon." The second one only has whatever the first person is left with, meaning if he sold it or she sold it and it was devoured, all the proceeds, then there's nothing left for the second person to get. Or if there's a little bit left, they'll get the little, but they can't demand it back from the lekuchot, and that's simply because they do have rights to the goof and they can sell the actual land. After establishing this tannaitic machloket, now the Gemara is going to bring a totally contradictory passage. And Rebbi and Rashbag are going to seem to say opposite things of what they said in the previous braitot that we learned. Seems like a similar case, right? My proceeds, my property goes to you, and after that it will go to somebody else. If the first person wants, they can go and sell and eat all the proceeds, and there'll be nothing left. Divrei Rebbi. Now that sounds like they can sell it, and kinyan braitot is like kinyan aguf. They own the actual item. Now that's the opposite of what Rebbi said earlier, which was if he does that or she does it and sells it, the second person can't take anything out from the people who purchased it. If there's nothing left, they don't get anything. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, ein l'rishon ela achila perot bilvad. Now they are wording things differently, and eventually we're going to try to explain this. But Rashbag says the first person only has rights to the braitot. They can't sell the land itself. Now, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel on the first source said, if the first person sells it, then there's nothing left for the second person, which means that the sale goes through. This seems to say you can't sell it. So kasha de Rebbi de Rebbi u de Rashbag de Rashbag. So Rebbi contradicts Rebbi, Rashbag contradicts Rashbag. How can we reconcile? So the Gemara says, let's take one at a time. Rebbi ad Rebbi lo kasha. Rebbi doesn't contradict Rebbi because halagufa halapere. It was different situations. One is he was selling. Excuse me. One is he was selling the original person who said, I'm giving you my property or my possessions. In one case, they were talking about I'm giving you the actual possessions itself, the land. In the other, it was I'm only giving you the proceeds. So in the first case, it was I'm giving you only the proceeds. And therefore, if he sells it, the second person can take it away from the purchasers. But in the second case, the original person sold the land itself. And therefore, when it says the Rishon, Yored, Rishon, Mocher, V'ocher, you can get rid of it all is because they actually acquired the rights to the principal. So it really depends on what they said. Now we have, just one second, Halagufa. Okay. Now we're going to go to the difficulty of Rashbag over the Rashbag. Ud Rashbag the Rashbag lo kashya halachatchila hadiavad. Let's start with the second case. The second case, Rashbag says, Ein l'rishon ela chila perot bilvad. Now, even though Rashbag holds kinyan perot is like kinyan aguf, still, he says it's not appropriate, though, since it was supposed to be given to somebody else after you, that you sell it all. So you really shouldn't do more than taking the proceeds. That's lechatchila in an ideal world. However, since kinyan aguf is kinyan perot is kinyan aguf, you do acquire the actual principal. Then we go back to the first braitot, which is b'diavad. If you did it anyway, though, you shouldn't. But if you did it anyway, ein l'sheni ela masha shiur rishon. Well, then it's a valid sale, and the second person can't demand the land back from the purchasers because the first person had the rights to sell it. So we've resolved the contradiction, and with that, we're going to move on. So we're left with, there's a machloket between Rebbi and Rashbag. We're going to see that all the poskim seem to hold like Rashbag, which really means that the first person does have rights to the kinyan aguf. But what did we say? If we hold like Rashbag and the way we explain Rashbag, but ideally you shouldn't sell it because really the original person wanted something to be left for person number two to get when person number one dies. So Amar Rabbi, in light of this, is a rasha arom. Okay, literally this means a naked, wicked person. Okay, what it means is, but not really, a room here doesn't mean naked, but it could come from armumi, like a trickster. If you want to be a really bad person or someone who, conniving, what can you do? What would we call someone? It would be someone, why would we call you a rasha arom? If there was such a situation and you advised person number one to sell all the land and devour the proceeds and leave nothing for person number two, that would be a rasha arom, a room to basically try to convince someone that this is what they should do. Because again, what did we say? Ideally, they shouldn't, but if they do it, it's effective. So you're basically writing someone out of what's really rightfully, what they should be able to inherit. I'm a Rabbi Yochanan, halacha ke Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan also holds like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and says, he says very straight out, we hold like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Umodeh, however, he agrees though, or admits, if person number one, after they inherit the property and the rights to, theoretically, not just the proceeds, but also to the land itself, if they decide, okay, now if they sell it during their lifetime, they shouldn't, but if they do, it's a valid sale. However, if they decide to gift it to someone on their deathbed, they're about to die, and they don't need it anymore because they're about to die, and they gift it to somebody else to avoid it going to person number two, lo asaklum, that is actually not effective. Now, why is it not effective? You could see, okay, it's not appropriate to do, but not effective, why not? Well, my timer. So the way a gift works, Abaye says, technically speaking, there's a problem here. Because the way a manat shchid merah works, and this could be a little interesting, we're going to make a distinction between the moment of death and after the moment of death. So manat shchid merah only is acquired. What do we learn? If you say on your deathbed, I'm giving something to someone, it's as if you did a kinyan. But when does the kinyan kick in? When is it acquired by the person? Not until you die, because you didn't really mean to give to them unless you're dead and unless you're sure you're dead. When are you sure you're dead? After death. So it only takes effect after you're already dead. Now, in this case, what happened? As you died after death, but at the moment of death, well, it already wasn't yours anymore, because what did the person originally say? It's yours through your lifetime. As soon as you're not alive anymore, it goes to person two. So it already went to person two before we get to the moment of after death. There's the moment of death and the moment after death. At the moment of death, it already got past to person two. At the moment after death, you try to give it as a gift. Well, you don't own it anymore. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute. Wait, did Abaye really say that Manat shchid merah is only after death? There's a machloket about this. And let's see what Abaye says. Manat shchid merah me'amatai kana. From when is a gift of a dead person effective? Abaye amal im gmar mita. Abaye says as soon as you completely die, not after death, but at the moment of death. The Rava amar lachar gmar mita. Rava is the one who says after death, not Abaye. Abaye thinks it's in gmar mita. And if it's gmar mita, then at the same moment we have this conflict. One person's giving it as a gift, and the other ruling says, well, it should go to this person number two. And then that all happens simultaneously. And then Abaye is not, that's not what Abaye said. So Abaye seems to contradict himself. To which, to resolve this, the Gemara says, Hadran Abaye mehahi. Abaye originally disagreed with Rava about when is a matnat chid meira acquired, and thought it was before, at the moment of death, but then changed his mind and agreed with Rava that it's after the death is already done, and therefore goes back to reinstate what Abaye said earlier about our case, and that stands. That again, if he does it on his deathbed or she does it on her deathbed, it's not going to be effective because it's already been given to person number two before. Now the Gemara says, okay, well, there's a contradiction between Abaye statement one, Abaye statement two. We said, change Abaye statement two, but maybe we should change Abaye statement one. Maybe we should say, Abaye changed his mind about the first thing he said. Why do we assume it was the second thing we quoted? To which the Gemara said, Lo salkadatach. It doesn't make sense that Abaye would change his mind about the, in the first part, and that he would change his mind and say, oh no, matnat chivera is actually acquired earlier. Why is that? Because there's a mission that seems to imply that a matnat chivera is only going to be after death. And the way we're going to learn this is not from a matnat chivera, from a gift of someone on their deathbed, but someone who's trying to divorce his wife, give her a divorce when he's dead. Why would someone do that? He's already, right, he's going to be dead. Why does he want to have a gift kick in once he dies? Just like this matnat chivera, we understand, right? You want to keep your possessions till you die. You want it to kick in only after death. Again, you'd want to kick in after death, although we're going to see you can't do this. You might remember from Masechet Gitin. But you wanted to do that because you want your wife not to be a yavama. You don't want her to have to do levirate marriage. You don't want her to have to marry the brother or do chalitza with your brother. So you basically say, this is your get when I die. Now, if you say, zegitef imati, this is your get if I die, or you say, zegitech mecholi zed, this is your get if I die from this disease, or zegitech la'achar mitar, this is your get after I die, lo amar klum, this doesn't work. And why is that? Because ein get la'achar mita, there's no get giving after death. You can't do that. And what do you see here? All these languages, the problem is that the get kicks in after death. So we're going to basically say that since a get that you want to take effect after death is like a gift that you want to take effect after death, and the get after death is considered after you die, not at the moment of death, but after you die. Therefore, also the matnat chivera is only going to go into effect after you die, and that's why we assume that Abaye, and going with the simple reading of this Mishnah, or the implications of this Mishnah to our case, you would say he must have changed his mind and assumed that a gift is only after death and not at the moment of death. I'm a Rabbi Zera. I'm a Rabbi Yochanan. And again, we're going to see a psikat in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Zera brings down this halacha. So far, it sounds the same as we said Rabbi Yochanan originally, but he's going to add something. Halacha ki Rashbag. So he says that Rabbi Yochanan says the halacha is like Rashbag. That's from Meshum ben Gamliel. Va'afilu hayu behen avadim v'hotzi'an lechirut. And even if what person number one inherited was Canaanite slaves, and person number one freed them. Now, once they're free, they're no longer the possessions of the owner. They become free. They actually become Jews, and they're just part of the Jewish people, and they're not owned by the person anymore. And that would work also, and then the person number two wouldn't get anything because, again, kinyan perot is even kikinyan guf, and he owns the guf. He can release them then from slavery. To which the Gemara says, pshita. Okay, obviously, what are you adding here? If kinyan perot is kikinyan guf, then obviously if he frees them, it's his to free, and he can do that. Well, you could say the following. The person who gave person number one, the slave, gave it in order that person number one will pass it on to person number two and limited its use somewhat. Perhaps he limited its use even more so by saying, in other words, by giving him only limited use of this object, and in this case, it was actually a person. It could be he was saying, well, I'm giving my possessions to you, So you can do with them what you want, but what it really means is, again, we talked about before, it really means you're just getting the proceeds, possibly. Now, Rashbag does think you acquire the body of it, but perhaps it's not to do something that's forbidden by law, by Torah law. Now, it's forbidden to free a slave, even though you can, but you shouldn't. The Torah says, Lo olam behem ta'avodu. If you have Canaanite slaves, they're supposed to be your slaves forever. And you're supposed to pass them down inheritance. You're not supposed to free them. Now, if you free them, they become Jews because they've already gone a pseudo conversion when they come into your house. The whole thing we've learned about them, I'm not going to go over that right now. But the point is, you might have thought that when you got this, when first person got this gift, maybe it was limited to do with it things that are permitted. Maybe the person didn't want you to be doing forbidden things with it. Kamash Malan comes this to teach you. Rabbi Zera said, halachas like Rashbag, even if it means you freed your slave, because even if you did something forbidden by law, still it was yours to do. Okay, your use of this item wasn't limited. Now we're going to see something very similar that was said in the name of Rabbi Yosef, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rabbi Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, halakha ke Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, even if he took the possessions and turned them into shrouds for a dead person. Okay, the Gemara says pshita. Okay, what? That's certainly not something wrong. Well, if you were given a gift in order to pass it on ultimately to somebody else, so maybe you can't turn it into something that nobody will be able to benefit from. So you might have thought that would be the case, and therefore, again, person number one is limited in their what they could do. You might have thought, Kamash Balan comes Rabbi Yosef to tell us in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the halacha like Rashbag, even in this case. And if the person made it, tachrichin lamed, shrouds, burial shrouds, well, they did, and it's effective. So again, we see that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel basically says that anything you do with these items is effective. Okay, even though ideally you shouldn't be doing things that are going to preclude person number two from getting them in your death. But if you did, it's effective. Darash Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda. Now we're going to move into the laws of etrog. Okay, you need to know the background of this is etrog, and we mean even lulav and all of the four species. That when you have them on the first day, it says in the Torah, you have to take for you. For you means you have to own them. And we're going to learn later on in today's stuff what we do today. What if you don't own it, right? That's why ideally everyone in the house should have their own lulav for day number one. Now, in the event that you don't, maybe there's ways around it, but we're going to learn now. So with that in your background, think in your head that you have to be the owner of this etrog. So Darash Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda, he taught the following. Etrog zeh natun lecha b'matana, v'acharecha leploni. Okay, they didn't live in a world like we do, where most of us live in a place where it's pretty easy to get etrog game. Everybody buys their own etrog every year, even if you share maybe, but every family ends up getting an etrog, let's say. Or if you want to, you could. But in this place, they didn't really have a lot of etrogim. And in fact, not only did they share them, presumably, but they passed them down in inheritance. So, right, we're not really talking about the sharing element. We're just talking about an etrog that was passed down in inheritance. I don't know how they kept it in good shape. But etrog ze natun lecha b'matana. So someone says, I'm giving you my etrog, and acharecha leploni. And after that, it'll go to somebody else. Nitalo rishon v'yatzabo. If he took it, the first person, and made a bracha on it, and was yotzei the mitzvah, banu lemachloket Rebbi v'Rashbag. We now get into this debate between Rebbi and Rashbag. Now, it seems that the question is, can you be yotzei the mitzvah? Why? If you need to be the owner of it, but you only own it, kinyan perot, the proceeds of it, then you don't really own the etrog, then you can't be yotzei the mitzvah. That would be Rebbi. If you hold like Rashbag, that you own the etrog, because owning the proceeds is like owning everything about it, then you own it, and then you can fulfill the mitzvah. But Matkifla Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Rav Yitzchak says, what are you talking about? This can't possibly be the meaning of what Rav Nachman said. Adkan lo pligi Rebbi v'Rashbag hatam ela demar sevar kinyan peirot kinyan aguf dami yamar sevar kinyan peirot lav kinyan aguf dami. Okay, that's just a repeat of what we know, which is the machloket there that we saw in the beginning of the daf was, is kinyan peirot like kinyan aguf or not? Elahacha, but in our case, turning out amabet, imat mepak lo nafik be lemaya havina neale. In the case that we talked about before, you got land and you could benefit from the proceeds if you were person number one. But in this case, if I give you my etrog and you can't really use it to fulfill the mitzvah, so why did I give it to you? So it means if you're not going to be able to be yotze to fulfill your mitzvah using this, then what did I give it to you for then? In other words, it doesn't make any sense. It's actually kind of funny to look at it in this perspective, because so what I intended. But kinyanim and passing on rights has a lot to do with what the intent of the person is. We talk about this all the time. Someone gives you something, what was their intent? Did they really mean to give it to you? Did they mean to give it to you completely or not completely? Right. So my intent is very important, what I intended. So why else would I give you an etrog if not to fulfill the mitzvah? So the subjective element of a kinyan, right? There's an objective element, which is it's in your possession. But if I gave it to you just to borrow, then it's not yours, right? It very much matters what I intended. So it doesn't really make any sense that anybody would think that I didn't give it to you to fulfill the mitzvah with, in which case you must own it. Okay, one could say, by the way, if you don't want to look at it in terms of a kinyan, could be, I can give it to you in a limited way, but you might say for the purposes of the mitzvah of lakachtem lachem, perhaps this is enough of ownership to fulfill that mitzvah of it being yours. That's also another way to look at it. But now the Gemara says, Ella, or actually it's not the Gemara, it's Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak who brought up this difficulty. Now says what it must be that the other Rav Nachman was saying is, everybody agrees that the person who got the etrog clearly can use it for the mitzvah, because what other purpose would they have gotten this etrog for? But the question is, mechara or achla, what if the person sold the etrog or ate it? Okay, meaning, sold it and got rid of all the proceeds. Banu lemachloket Rebbi for Rabban Shimon and Gamliel. Then we're going to get into this machloket. It's going to be the same thing of Rebbi and Rabban Shimon and Gamliel, which is if, let's say, they sold the etrog, could person number two take it out of the possession of the buyers when person number one dies and they're supposed to get it back? Can they do that or not? Now, you might say, I don't understand. Why wouldn't it be the same issue? Obviously, it's the same issue, because why is this different than my possessions are to you, my etrog is to you, and it's going to someone else after? And of course, they have the same machloket. Well, the thinking is that perhaps maybe you would think that the etrog isn't, in the case of land with proceeds, I understand you got the proceeds, not the land. But in the case of the etrog, there are no proceeds. It would just be use of the etrog. And maybe you would own the goof of the etrog, which is the etrog itself. And maybe you could actually sell it, even according to those who say you can't, which is Rebbi. But in the end, they say, no, it's really the same machloket. And that's the chiddush of what Rav Nachman is telling you. In continuing in this etrog issue, other issues that come up with etrogim. Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna. Ha'achim shekanu etrog b'tfusat habayit. Let's say the brothers buy an etrog with the father's estate. They haven't yet divided it up. One of them comes along, uses it for the mitzvah, and makes the blessing. Now the question is, was it considered his? Because it was really jointly owned by all the brothers. That doesn't mean it's yours. It has to be yours completely. Like if you have one set in the house, you can't just everybody use it. Okay, people think you can, but you really on the first day you can't do that. You will see what you do if you have that situation. Im yachol ochlo yatsa, v'im lav lo yatsa. If you can eat it, then you fulfill your... Okay, now, what does this mean? If you can eat it and they wouldn't stop you, meaning they don't care, presumably because maybe they have their own etrogim. Okay, they don't care, then you're yotze, because we assume that they're willing to let you have it as your own. So when you take it, it automatically becomes your own. We've talked about this before, like brera, which is later on, when you take it, it's as if it was divided up and it was yours from the beginning. V'im lav, but if not, if they all want the etrog and they're all vying for it and you just pick it up and use it, well, then that belongs to everybody and lo yatzah, you won't fulfill your obligation. Now the Gemara adds this line, which the Rashbam kind of takes out, and there's a bit of a deliberation about whether this really belongs here or not, what it's really adding, because it sounds like a bit of a repeat of before, and some of the words don't really seem necessary. This is only if everyone has their own etrog. About parish or rimon lo. This is the part that certainly seems extra. What's the difference whether they have no etrog or they have a parisha or rimon? A parisha or rimon is a quince or a pomegranate. Okay, well, first of all, it comes up in sukkah. Maybe that's why it's here, because they always say a parisha and a rimon are not, you can't use them for an etrog. Now, you might have thought, why would you think you could? But obviously, at some point, maybe they were trying to figure out. It says pre-eitz hadar. So maybe you would have thought one of these could be used. And the answer is that if they have an etrog, then if they each have their own etrog, then we can assume that this one can be yours. But if they have a parisha or rimon, or presumably no fruits or no anything that could count as arba minim, or they just don't have an etrog, then it can't be yours. Okay, so this seems to be explaining what we already explained, so not so clear what this is doing here. Amar Rava, etrog ze natun lecha b'matana amanat shetachzirehu li. What if you say, and this is what people often do on the first day of Sukkot, say, I'm giving you this as a gift on the condition that you return it to me. So you gift it to someone, and that's really the way to do it on Sukkot. You gift it to someone. Even if they're planning to give it back to you, perhaps you need to say, right, if you haven't done it your own mitzvah yet that day, then you would have to say, right? You want to get it back. But if you give it to someone as a gift on the condition that they return it to you, so the question is, can they fulfill the mitzvah this way? Well, we're going to see what the question is. Well, nitalo v'yatzabo, if he took it and made the bracha, hichziro yatza, lo hichziro lo yatza. If the person returns it to you, then they fulfill their obligation. Why? Or if let's go continue and say, if they didn't return it to you, though, they didn't fulfill their obligation. Why? Because when that person doesn't return it to you, well, then it turns out it wasn't a gift because they didn't fulfill your condition. You gave it to them upon condition that they will return it to you. But if they didn't return it, then they didn't fulfill your condition. Then it wasn't gifted to them. If it wasn't gifted to them, then they can't fulfill the mitzvah because it's not lachem. It doesn't belong to them. Kamash malan, and Rava points out that you can learn from this, that it is considered a gift, even if you plan to take it back. So you might say, what do you mean? It's a temporary gift. A gift is something you give to someone for the long term. Well, this teaches you a gift that you're going to eventually take back or even immediately take back is still considered a gift. And this is how people do it on Sukkot. They give it as a gift temporarily to somebody else, even though it's not really a gift, but that temporarily makes them the owner. Now we have a case, it's a pretty sad case for this poor woman. She had a palm tree in the property of Rabbi Bar Abaye. Now, if you remember all those sugya we had about buying a path, right? She didn't have a path to get there. So to get to her tree, she had to walk through Rabbi Bar Abaye's property. Well, every time she went to cut fruits off the tree, he got angry at her. You're ruining my plans. I just planted stuff. You're destroying them. She got frustrated by the whole situation and didn't really want to go to the tree anymore because every time she got screamed at. So she basically gives him rights to use the tree for the rest of his lifetime. But after his lifetime, she was going to take it back. So she gave it to him temporarily, use of the tree. Well, what did he do? If you're hold like Rashbag, which the rabbis do, that kind of gift is temporary, but kinyan pero kinyan aguf. He has rights to the proceeds. He can actually sell the tree. So what did he do? He didn't want to sell it because he wanted to use it. So he went. He sells it to a small child. Okay. Now, this was really not so appropriate. Selling it to someone else, okay, but he sold it to his own son. I'm a Rav Huna Bereit Rabbi, and then with that, right? Kinyan Apero Kinyan Aguf. Now it's owned by someone else, and now she'll never be able to take it back because it's not even owned by him anymore. Well, Rav Huna Bereit Rabbi Yoshua didn't like this. I'm a Rav Huna Bereit Rabbi Yoshua. Mishum da'ate mimolaya maritu mila moliyata. There's different interpretations about this. We've seen it a bunch of times. Some commentaries explain what you come from the house of Eli, so Eli's sons were cut off, right? They got punished. They were going to get killed. And they died young, and there was this punishment that they were going to all die young. You come from a family that's cut off, and you say things that are cut off that don't make any sense. You kind of say things half. Okay, you don't say them properly. Afilu Rashbag. There's some people who understand it differently. There was a place, mimolai, and kind of play on words there. Afilu Rashbag lo ka'amar elo la'achil aval la'atzmo lo. Rashbag said you could sell it to someone else, but he didn't say you could sell it to yourself. And selling it to your young child is basically like selling it to yourself. Okay, this is when people do tax evasions with all sorts of, giving things to their children when it's really their own, right? It's kind of challenging, right? Certainly if it's your minor children who are living in your house and sharing the same money. Amar Rav Nachman. Shur ze natun lecha b'matana amanat shetachzirehu li. Here comes Rav. He says in the name of Rav Nachman the following halacha. If you say this shur, we're with this issue of returning a gift, this ox is given to you as a gift on the condition that you return me the ox. What if the person went along, hikdisho, and consecrated it to the temple? Vihichziro, and then returned it. So now he returns the ox, but the ox is worth nothing anymore because it's all sanctified, it's consecrated to the temple. So for the owner, it's not worth anything. He can't use it at all. So Hareze Mukudash Umuchsal comes Rav Nachman and says, this animal, the consecration is effective because that person really was the owner. Why are they the owner? Because they actually returned it. Since they returned it, it means they actually were able to consecrate it, even though when they returned it, it wasn't worth the same amount as it was worth when they started. It was worth, let's say, 200 when they started, and now it's worth nothing. But he returned the ox. So Amarle Rava, after Rava quotes this from Rav Nachman, he says to Rav Nachman, "My Hadre, what do you mean you returned it? This person didn't return anything. He returned something worth nothing. Because you returned something worth nothing, it turns out he never really received it because he didn't really return it, which means it wasn't ever his, which means when he consecrated it, it was a useless consecration because he didn't own it. You can't consecrate something you don't own." So Amarle, Rav Nachman says, Umay Chasre. Well, what do you mean? What did he lose for the original owner? The original owner got the ox back. Now, it's true the ox isn't worth anything, but he got a physical ox back. So if the original owner gets back an ox, it's true the ox isn't worth anything, but it is an ox. So that's considered returned. So they have this debate about whether returning the actual physical ox, which is now consecrated to the temple, is that considered returned? Or is that considered not returned, which in turn makes, it's a little bit confusing. If it's not returned, then it was never the person who got it as a gift to actually consecrate, and then it's not consecrated. So Ela Amar Rav Ashi, after Rava asked this question, and then Rav Nachman responds, Rav Ashi explains the following. Chazina, we assess the situation. It really depends on what happens. And not what happens, but what happened originally. What the original gift, how it was stated. If, let's say it was me who gave you an ox. If I said when I gave you the ox, I'm giving it on the condition that you return the ox. Ha. Well, if you consecrated it and returned the ox, I got my ox back. So it's true it's not worth anything, but I got it back, and that's what Rav Nachman said. But if I said on the condition you return it to me, that's a whole different story, because then me ended up with nothing in the end. And therefore, I meant I want it back so I can use it. And if I can't use it now because it's consecrated, it's as if I never got it back. And if I don't get it back, then it was never a gift in the first place because you didn't fulfill my condition of returning it. And then when you consecrated it, it's nothing. We'll end with this next part, which really is going to continue into tomorrow's daf. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, hakotev nechasav la'achil, va'amar hala efshi bahin. What if I give you a gift and you say thanks, but no thanks, I don't want it? Hana, this is very surprising. Even though you got the gift and you don't want it, and you said I don't want it, it's acquired by you. Even if you're screaming, I'm not interested in that, doesn't matter. Rabbi Yochanan Amar lo kana. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you didn't acquire it. So now we don't really understand why this is. We'll wait till tomorrow to see. But Amar Rabbi Abba Bar Mama v'lo pligi, and he's going to basically say there's really no machloka between them. They were each trying about different circumstances, and when we learn those circumstances in tomorrow's daf, we'll figure out what the distinction is and why this makes sense. That someone who says I don't want to give, it's actually going to be acquired by them. So what do we have today? We started with this saying that this machloket about kinyan perut, kinyan aguf, or lav kinyan aguf. Do you actually acquire the principle, and is your sale going to be valid if you sell it to someone or not? And particularly in this case of nekasah lecha lecharecha leploni, where we view it as if it's like you only have rights to the proceeds, because in the end the object is going to, the goof, the principle is going to go to somebody else. So is it effective or not? And then we saw a contradiction. So we saw it was a machloket between Rebbi and Mashbag. Then, which is the same machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Then we brought a contradiction. Rabbi Yochanan seems to say the opposite in a different braitot, but we resolved it by explaining the differences between the two texts, the two braitot. Then we saw that both Abaye, Rabbi Yochanan held like Mashbag. We saw people who quoted, right? We had a bit of a question about, right? We saw that they were moded, that if a shlib meira, if the first person was a shlib meira, when they gifted it to somebody else, that wouldn't be effective because that only takes place after death. With that, we got into this whole discussion about moment of death, after death, what takes place when. From there, we got into two psikot halacha in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that we hold like Rashbag, even if you do something forbidden with it, even if you turn it into something that's not permitted to benefit from, like shrouds for a dead person, it doesn't matter because it wasn't a limited sale in that sense in what you could do with it while it was in your possession. Then we saw the whole thing about the etrog, and maybe an etrog is different, but then we saw that an etrog, right, in terms of B'yotze the mitzvah, it is different. You don't actually have to own the principal for it to be considered lachem, because why else did they give it to you if not to fulfill the mitzvah? But yes, if you sold it and it didn't go to the other person, that would be the same machloket of Rebbi and Rashbag. And then we talked about what if you took from the inheritance without, it wasn't yet divided, and you took one of the etrogim, could that be considered yours or not, depending on the scenario? Then we saw, what if you give it as a gift in order to return it? We saw the whole thing with, if you don't return a gift that you're supposed to return, then it ends up retroactively, it wasn't ever a gift. And we talked about that also in the context of the case with the ox. And if somebody consecrates it. And in between that, we saw the story of the woman with her dekel tree, with her tree that she basically gave to this rabbi for his lifetime. He sold it to his son. Well, that's a whole different story. You can't sell things to your son because, right, your son who's a minor, because that's really like selling it to yourself. That obviously wouldn't work. And with that, we finish today's daf, wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Shnishma B'Sarot Tovot.